Dungeon crawling is a ubiquitous fantasy and role playing game trope where the intrepid adventurers enter a cramped, labyrinthine series of tunnels and fight monsters, steal treasure, and disarm traps. Personally, I think any scenario where this happens in real life would be incredibly horrifying. I kind of imagine it as a combination of cave diving or just caving and trench warfare. It's not the sort of thing that I would really want to do, but it is super fun in games. And I would like to say what sort of loadout I would choose if I were to really have to go into a dungeon and fight monsters. So the first thing is getting into the dungeon itself. I would say a rope ladder would be more so what you would use rather than what most people's first idea is going to be, a grappling hook. As it turns out, single rope techniques for spelunking have only existed since the early 20th century. Before that, in the 1800s and previous, they would use rope ladders for cave exploration. And it makes sense. A grappling hook is really useful when you have modern aluminum, modern alloys, and things like that. Whereas if you've got medieval tech, you are going to want to have more security than a grappling hook is going to provide you. I'd say that a ladder like this is more important when you're entering a natural dungeon like a cave rather than an artificial dungeon like a tomb or, say, an actual wizard's dungeon, because artificial constructs are more often built for us to be able to traverse them ourselves, but that's not always the case. After all, this photograph behind me is of the interior of the Great Pyramids. And the Egyptians did not put stairs and a handrail in there. So any sort of ruins, they can become ruined in a way that you can't move through them. So a rope ladder should absolutely be on your dungeon kit. Now, after you're in the dungeon, you're going to want to be able to see. And I would suggest going with a lantern rather than a torch. We always think of torches as the medieval light source, but for the most part, small things like candles, lanterns, if you look up what a rushlight is, that is what provided illumination in a medieval setting. An advantage this lantern specifically would have over a torch is it's got a closable hatch. So that if there's any situation where you need to hide, whether that be to avoid a monster or ambush a monster, you can close the hatch on your lantern and be in complete darkness. There's no way to darken a torch without just snuffing out the flame entirely. The other advantage a lantern has over a torch is that if you're in, say, a cave that doesn't have good ventilation, a big flame like a torch can eat up oxygen really quickly. And if you end up suffocating yourself, your adventuring party is never going to let you live that down, even if they do revive you. Now that we can enter the dungeon and see, we need to start thinking about how to protect ourselves from the monsters inside. My Vtuber model is wearing a type of chainmail called Lorica Hamada. And I think chainmail would be the best for most types of dungeons. The reason I think that is because when I worked as a security guard, they actually gave me a stab proof vest that was essentially a brigandine with modern plastics instead of steel. And I can tell you that any sort of crawling on the ground or squeezing into a tight passage or hopping a fence when your key doesn't actually work to get you out of the fence is a super pain in the ass wearing a brigandine type uh, armor. Anytime I was going into a dungeon where I would need to crawl around or climb, I would absolutely pick chainmail rather than brigandine or breastplate. And that theme of less protection but less encumbered also works with the shield that I would choose. I don't think in a cramped dungeon you're really going to have to deal with arrows too much. And it is with the dealing of projectiles that a full size shield is objectively better than a buckler, which is what I've got pictured here. It's absolutely, easier to use a full size shield in a fight. But when you're in a cramped environment, you're not going to be facing more than one enemy at a time. And space is at a premium, and a buckler is going to save space. Now, when it comes to the helmet, I'm thinking less about encumbrance and more about side passages and traps. I think any medieval adventurer that's going on a dungeon crawl should wear an open faced helmet just because you can keep a better eye out for stuff. That's not normally an important thing you need to consider in, a field battle, but when there might be a tripwire at your feet, it is very important to consider being able to see it. When it comes to weapons, this is my bollock dagger. A dagger is the kind of weapon that you are never going to want to be without. Because in a dungeon scenario, you might not have the space to swing a full-size sword. In fact, I've got a cutlass that I use to practice broadsword techniques inside my house. because there's just nowhere inside my house with enough room to practice with a full size broadsword. And I think a cramped dungeon would exacerbate that issue. Meanwhile, if you've got a large enough dagger, it is also functionally a short sword. In fact, the largest daggers are longer than the shortest swords. But a good sized dagger is going to be an important piece of equipment for any sort of dungeon crawler. Now, you might remember at the beginning of this video that I said a dungeon crawl is similar to trench warfare. And that is going to influence my decision for a primary weapon. The medieval mace and the World War I trench club are essentially the same thing. They did not change over hundreds of years. I would choose a mace to go into a dungeon because, first of all, they tend to be shorter than swords, still effective as a primary weapon. If you're in really tight confines, you can choke up on the mace. And lastly, if you hit an opponent in the head with a mace, that's just a off button. They're not going to scream out and, alert all the other monsters around. They're just going to hit the ground. My last choice for a weapon is a sling. You're probably not going to find much use for a projectile in a medieval fantasy dungeon. But if you want to be prepared in case you do, you're not going to want a full-sized warbow. Anything that is big enough to actually hurt a person is going to be too big to carry around a normal dungeon. And I think a sling, you can carry it in a pocket, you can wear it as a wristband, and you're not even going to notice it's there until you need it. And when you do need it, instead of carrying around a whole quiver full of arrows, you can fight with anything you can pick up off the ground. It should be a rock if you want to get the best ability out of your sling. Then you would use a lead bullet. But in all honesty, you can huck anything from a dead rat or bigger at your opponent, and it's going to hit them with enough force to ruin their day. Beyond that, I think if you are entering a kind of dungeon where it's an artificial construct, a tomb, a castle, an actual dungeon, you are going to want to carry around a lock-picking set. If you go into a natural cave and you find a locked door, then you are dealing with the Fae, and I cannot help you at all. But if you are going into a natural cave, instead of a lock-picking set, I might suggest carrying a piece of charcoal or some kind of chalk and a piece of paper. This is because you are going to want to mark down the way to the exit. This has been done by, Theseus with his golden thread, Hansel and Gretel with their breadcrumbs, and maybe you with a piece of chalk and paper. And I think that's it. I think that is the perfect loadout for going on a medieval adventure into a scary dungeon. Let me know if you disagree with anything that I have said, if you would pick something else, or if you think that something I've said would be actually detrimental. And if you'd like to hear more, maybe see if I talk about, I don't know, going on an adventure through a wasteland or being a town guard. Like and subscribe. I'll probably get around to it eventually. Thank you for listening. I have been Daniel Clemens, and happy dungeon diving.